The Pacific was a cauldron of fire and steel. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with the acrid scent of burning fuel and gunpowder. Waves crashed violently against the hull of the USS Yorktown, each one a reminder that survival in this ocean was never guaranteed. Above, Japanese planes roared like angry hawks, releasing their deadly payloads, each bomb and torpedo shaking the carrier to its core. Sailors clung to anything solid, hearts hammering, as fire raced across the decks and alarms blared relentlessly. Yorktown shuddered under the impact, listing dangerously to starboard, her pride as America's frontline hope seeming to crumble beneath the enemy onslaught. In the sky above, Japanese pilots banked sharply, eyes alight with triumph. They had done it. They had sunk the carrier that had stood in their way just days ago. Over the radio, laughter and cheers erupted, their messages dripping with certainty. Yorktown's gone. Victory is ours. Across the carriers and battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sailors and officers exchanged congratulations. Confidence swelled. They believed the balance of power in the Pacific had just shifted irrevocably. The Coral Sea, they thought, had delivered them a decisive triumph, but below decks, in the dimly lit corridors and command rooms, a different story was unfolding. American sailors and officers, battered and exhausted, were not surrendering to despair. Amidst the wreckage and chaos, a quiet determination simmered. Eyes met in fleeting glances, hands clenched on railings and consoles, and a single thought pulsed through the minds of those who remained: Yorktown will not die here. They moved with purpose, checking critical systems, shoring up bulkheads, and dragging injured comrades to safety. Even as smoke choked the air and fires raged, the crew refused to accept the narrative their enemies had written. Every act of repair, every shouted instruction, every silent prayer in the darkness was a defiance against the impossible. The Americans worked not for glory, not for recognition, but for survival of the ship, survival of the crew, and survival of a hope that seemed almost mythical. Somewhere deep in Pearl Harbor, engineers and strategists would soon hear the call to arms not of guns, but of ingenuity and endurance. For now, though, the battered carrier floated, wounded but unbroken, a hidden ember in the heart of an ocean that had witnessed so much death. Far to the west, the Japanese high command, their minds dancing with victory, plotted their next move. Midway Island lay ahead, a strategic jewel in the Pacific ripe for conquest. Sailors polished guns, sharpened plans, and prepared to sail into history with confidence, entirely unaware that the very ship they believed destroyed was not only alive but gathering strength, ready to change everything. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a blood-red glow over the waves, the stage was set. The Yorktown had survived Coral Sea. The Japanese celebrated their triumph, oblivious to the fact that history was about to turn on a single, stubborn American aircraft carrier. The ocean whispered a warning in the crash of its waves, but only one side seemed to hear it. Pearl Harbor, normally a hub of calm routines and naval precision, was now a hive of fevered activity. The damage reports from the Coral Sea had reached the docks. The USS Yorktown, carrier of American hope, had been written off by the enemy, but Pearl Harbor knew differently. And now, time itself had become the enemy. There was no room for doubt, no pause for hesitation. Every second mattered. The ship lay in dry dock, scarred and battered. Her flight deck was pockmarked with holes, her engines were crippled, and critical systems had been ripped apart by torpedoes and bombs. Smoke still clung stubbornly to the steel skeleton, a reminder of how close she had come to sinking. Engineers, sailors, and dockworkers moved with a single, desperate purpose, forming an almost human tide across the ship's surface and inside her bowels. Their mission was audacious: to resurrect a ship that should have been dead. Chief Engineer Rudy McCarthy inspected the damage, his hands tracing the jagged edges of torpedo holes, his mind calculating the impossible. "We've got 72 hours, he muttered under his breath, "and that's all we get." Around him, teams worked furiously, welding, hammering, patching, rewiring, never pausing, never looking away. Men carried planks, steel plates, and machinery up precarious ladders, sweat mixing with the salt spray from the harbor. Every tool, every bolt, Every decision could mean the difference between life and disaster. Inside the engine room, sparks flew as mechanics replaced mangled turbines and jury-rigged missing components. Pipes that once carried steam hissed under pressure as crews patched leaks with a mixture of ingenuity and sheer force of will. "Can she really sail again?" whispered one young sailor, eyes wide as he inspected a twisted shaft. Around him, the older hands only shook their heads, but their hands never stopped moving. Doubt existed only in fleeting thoughts. They had no time to dwell on it. On the flight deck, repair teams wrestled with massive pieces of metal, lifting and welding under the glare of temporary floodlights. Holes that once seemed insurmountable were covered with steel plates, torpedo damage reinforced with ingenuity that would later become legend. Pilots watched nervously, pacing along the deck, wondering if their beloved carrier would really fly again. The air was thick with tension, the smell of burning metal and oil, and the quiet, almost sacred sound of determination. Everywhere, stories of human courage intertwined with technical brilliance. Young sailors, some barely out of training, handled machinery as if born for it. Experienced engineers improvised solutions to problems no textbook had prepared them for. McCarthy barked orders with precision, his face streaked with soot, eyes scanning every corner. "Get that turbine running. Check the rudder. Don't waste a second." Each command was met with movement, and movement met results. Slowly, the impossible began to look possible. Meanwhile, observers and naval brass watched anxiously from the sidelines. Some shook their heads in disbelief. "A ship that should sink now rises?" muttered a skeptical officer. But in those corridors, every creak of steel, every hiss of steam, every spark from welding torches was a heartbeat, proof that Yorktown would not be denied. Time was against them, but resolve carried the day, even in this whirlwind of activity. Moments of quiet reflection punctuated the chaos. Sailors paused briefly to patch the uniforms of the wounded, to offer a hand to a comrade, to whisper prayers over machinery that had become as precious as any life. The carrier was more than steel and engines. It was a living symbol of American perseverance, of a refusal to bow to the enemy. As the hours ticked by, the ship began to take shape. Hull breaches were sealed, engines roared as mechanics coaxed them back to life, and the flight deck was cleared for takeoff drills. Every repair was a triumph, every completed system a small victory over fate itself. By the second day, the once damaged giant looked less like a battlefield casualty and more like the warship she had always been. Powerful, ready, and alive. But the most critical test still awaited. The journey from Pearl Harbor back into the Pacific, into a battle that would define history. There was no room for error. The Japanese, celebrating what they believed was victory, had no idea that within 72 hours, the Yorktown would sail again, fully armed, fully operational, and ready to strike at the heart of their ambitions. And so, as the sun rose over Pearl Harbor on the third day, the crews, exhausted, battered, yet unbroken, stood back to watch the carrier they had resurrected. A cheer rose quietly from those who had worked without sleep, without rest, driven only by determination. The Yorktown had been given back to the world, alive and ready, but far across the Pacific, Japanese strategists plotted, unaware of the ghost they thought they had buried. The countdown to Midway had begun. The Yorktown, reborn, would soon remind them that history often has a way of surprising even the most confident. Time was running out. The ocean was waiting, and the battle that would change everything was about to begin. Far to the west, in the calm of their command rooms and aboard their carriers, the Japanese Navy reveled in triumph. Reports of the USS Yorktown sinking had spread like wildfire, and the mood was electric. Admirals toasted their victory with sake, officers smiled confidently as they reviewed maps of the Pacific, and pilots recounted their exploits in the Coral Sea with laughter and pride. Every message they sent carried the certainty of dominance. Midway Island, a jewel of strategic importance, seemed already within their grasp. The enemy believed their course was unchallenged. The stage set for an unbroken march across the Pacific. In stark contrast, thousands of miles away and dimly lit rooms across Pearl Harbor, the American response was quiet, precise, and unyielding. Here, the battle was not fought with guns and bombs, but with brains, intuition, and an unrelenting obsession with detail. Codebreakers hunched over typewriters and radios, their eyes darting across streams of seemingly meaningless symbols and numbers. Every intercepted Japanese transmission was a puzzle, a potential key to turning the tide of war. Lieutenant Joseph Rochefort, head of the Navy's cryptographic unit, leaned over a cluttered desk, tracing a map with his finger. "They're talking about a location, Midway," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "But why Midway and why now?" His team worked in silence, pencils scratching, heads bent low as the hidden messages slowly revealed patterns. Japanese confidence was evident in the intercepted chatter. They believed the Yorktown sunk, that the American fleet was fractured, that victory was inevitable. Every assumption they made became an opening for the Americans to exploit. It was a psychological chess game. The Japanese celebrated in high spirits, unaware that their enemy was quietly setting traps of information and expectation. The codebreaker's task was grueling, demanding every ounce of focus and intellect. Messages came in fragments, heavily coded, often contradictory. Every intercepted signal had to be cross-referenced, every anomaly noted. Hours passed with the tension of unspoken understanding. The smallest error could cost lives, fleets, or the war itself. Meanwhile, American intelligence officers monitored the progress of repairs at Pearl Harbor, keeping the Yorktown's resurrection a closely guarded secret. To the Japanese, the carrier was a ghost, a ship that no longer sailed. But behind closed doors, the American teams planned for a confrontation they knew would arrive sooner than the Japanese anticipated. Every decoded message, every strategic decision was like laying the foundation for a trap. In Japanese command, celebrations began to take on a self-assured rhythm. Charts were spread across tables, coffee cups steaming, the smell of ink and tobacco heavy in the air. Officers outlined their attack plans on Midway, confident that they faced no resistance from a crippled enemy. Yet beneath the laughter, small signs of caution appeared. Reconnaissance reports suggested that something was stirring, some hints that not all was as it seemed. But these observations were fleeting, quickly dismissed in the rush of victory euphoria. Back at Pearl Harbor, American analysts leaned closer to their machines, reading every nuance in intercepted messages, listening for patterns in frequencies, noting the repetition of certain words. The sense of anticipation was electric. They knew the Japanese were marching confidently into a trap of their own making. The Yorktown, once thought dead, would soon emerge from the shadows to tip the balance of power. Every decoded phrase reinforced the urgency. Time was short, preparation was everything, and the enemy knew nothing. Across the Pacific, Japanese strategists plotted their attack on Midway with careful precision. Maps were drawn and redrawn, formations rehearsed, supplies allocated. Sailors polished their guns and prepped planes, their morale buoyed by the belief that their path was unchallenged. Not a single one of them imagined that an American carrier, once declared lost, was now steaming toward them, ready to strike at the heart of their plan. Subtle hints of danger flickered in the periphery recon reports, the faintest disturbances in radio chatter, but were dismissed as anomalies. Confidence blinded judgment. In contrast, the Americans waited patiently, each piece of intelligence a small weapon, each decoded message a step closer to turning the tables. The psychological advantage had shifted without the Japanese even realizing it. What they considered victory was, in reality, a prelude to disaster. The contrast could not have been starker. One side basked in overconfidence, celebrating a victory that was not theirs. The other, silent and meticulous, quietly prepared for the moment when history would bend in their favor. Every hour, every decision, every moment of secrecy brought the Americans closer to the confrontation that would define the Pacific theater. The stage was set. The trap was ready. And the Yorktown, hidden from enemy eyes, waited to change everything. Soon, the Japanese Navy would learn a truth that no amount of celebration could prepare them for. The ship they thought destroyed was alive. The carrier that should have been lost was poised to strike. And when the first planes of the Yorktown roared into the sky over Midway, The illusion of Japanese dominance would shatter in an instant. The first light of dawn fell over Pearl Harbor, casting a pale glow on the hulking silhouette of the USS Yorktown. She lay in dry dock, battered, scarred, but unmistakably alive. The final hours of preparation were underway, and every corner of the ship throbbed with urgency. Engineers moved with practiced precision, checking turbines, testing the engines, and confirming that the ship could respond as if she had never been touched by torpedoes or bombs. Sparks flew from welding torches, steam hissed from hastily patched pipes, and every clang of metal on metal echoed like a heartbeat, a rhythm of defiance against the disaster that had almost claimed her. Sailors scurried across the decks, their movements sharp and deliberate. Flight crews inspected their planes, checking every bolt and wire as if the lives of themselves and their comrades depended on it, because they did. Ordnance officers carefully loaded ammunition into the guns, each shell a promise that the Yorktown would fight again. In the engine room, turbines roared to life for the first time in days, sending vibrations up the hull, reverberating through the hearts of every man on board. The carrier was waking, a giant stirring after a near-death slumber. Lieutenant Commander George Murray, overseeing the final checks, glanced across the deck. Sweat streaked his face, eyes narrowed, but a glimmer of pride shone in his gaze. "Let's show them what she's made of," he said quietly, almost to himself. Around him, sailors worked in perfect coordination, every movement precise, every order executed without hesitation. Time was short, but morale was high. The impossible had been accomplished, and now it was time to prove it in the open sea. The flight deck crews ran final drills, rolling aircraft into position, engines humming, propellers spinning with the potential for immediate takeoff. A pilot ran a final checklist, feeling the vibrations of the deck beneath him, imagining the enemy unaware of what was about to strike. In the hangars below, planes were refueled, armed, and inspected for signs of damage that could compromise the mission. Every man aboard knew the stakes. They were sailing into a battle where every decision, every maneuver, every bullet fired could tip the scales of history. Outside the dry dock, the waters of Pearl Harbor were calm, almost serene, belying the fury and chaos that had defined the Yorktown's journey over the past 72 hours. As the gates of the dock slowly opened, the carrier began to move, her engines straining against the water with a power that seemed almost supernatural. The ship glided forward, a phoenix rising from the ashes, smoke still curling faintly from past fires, her steel frame gleaming in the rising sun. Sailors lined the rails, faces a mixture of exhaustion and fierce determination, watching as their home, their sanctuary, their weapon, took to the water once more. The scene was almost cinematic's team rising like mist from the bow, sailors moving like shadows across the decks, the hum of engines swelling into a roar that filled the harbor. On the pier, dock workers and engineers who had labored nonstop for 3 days stood silently, watching their creation reclaim the sea. The Yorktown was no longer a casualty. She was a statement, a warning, and a promise all at once. Even as the carrier sailed toward open water, Japanese reconnaissance remained blind to her resurrection. Reports of the Yorktown's destruction had traveled across the Pacific, convincing the enemy that this formidable American ship no longer existed. Officers aboard Japanese carriers plotted their assault on Midway, unaware that the very ship they had celebrated sinking was now steaming toward them, fully operational and ready to strike. The element of surprise would soon become the Americans' greatest weapon. Below deck, the crew braced themselves, tension tight in every muscle. The exhilaration of survival was tempered by the knowledge of what lay ahead. Enemy planes, enemy carriers, and enemy guns waited beyond the horizon, ready to test their mettle. Every sailor, every officer, every pilot knew that the Yorktown's rebirth was only the beginning. The true test would come in the skies above Midway, where the lives of men and the fate of nations would collide in a thunder of fire and steel. As the carrier cut through the water, the wake behind her seemed to carve a line of destiny across the Pacific. The engines' roar, the hum of planes, the disciplined march of sailors, it all signaled one truth: the Yorktown was alive, ready, and unbroken. From the docks to the open sea, from despair to triumph, the ship had emerged stronger than ever. A symbol of resilience and American ingenuity, and as she disappeared into the horizon, bound for the battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific, the tension was palpable. The Japanese still celebrated, oblivious to the shadow that now moved against them. The Yorktown, once presumed lost, was poised to strike, to surprise, and to turn the tide. The stage was set. The actors were ready. History was about to be written, and the Yorktown would play the role no one saw coming. The morning over Midway was deceptively calm. The sun glinted off the endless blue of the Pacific, waves sparkling under a sky that betrayed nothing of the chaos about to unfold. But beneath that serene surface, the air was electric with tension. The Imperial Japanese Navy had already begun its assault on the atoll, planes streaking through the sky in precise formations, bombs ready to fall, torpedoes primed to strike. It was a well-orchestrated attack, executed with confidence, born from the belief that the American carriers had been crippled, destroyed, or scattered. And then came the roar, a sound no Japanese pilot expected. The USS Yorktown, alive, roaring, and fully armed, emerged from the horizon like a steel phantom. Pilots on the Japanese carriers squinted against the glare, disbelief washing over them. Reports crackled across radio channels. Is that the Yorktown? Their certainty faltered, replaced by confusion and alarm. The carrier they had celebrated sinking was not only present but ready for battle, on the flight deck of the Yorktown. Pilots sprinted across the deck, engines warming, propellers spinning, planes teetering on the edge of launch. There was no hesitation, no fear of the impossible. They had trained for this moment, and now it had come in the raw, unforgiving reality of war. Lieutenant William "Will" Johnson climbed into his fighter, heart pounding, hands steady on the controls. Around him, squadron mates followed in tight formation, aircraft rolling forward, guns primed, bombs secured. The carrier's deck roared with motion, a hive of precision and focus. The first planes took off into the brightening sky, engines screaming, leaving trails of vapor and fire as they climbed toward the Japanese fleet. Every turn, every maneuver, every bomb dropped with exacting skill chipped away at the illusion of Japanese supremacy. Dive bombers plummeted toward enemy carriers, torpedo squadrons darted low over the waves, striking with the precision that years of training had forged into instinct. Smoke and fire began to bloom on Japanese decks, and for the first time, the balance of power wavered above it all. The Japanese command was thrown into disarray. Officers barked orders, but their confidence was fractured. Reconnaissance had reported no carriers, yet now targets were hitting with deadly accuracy. Pilots shouted into radios, searching the horizon for explanation, while bombs detonated on decks that had seemed invulnerable just hours ago. The celebration of Coral Sea faded into panic. Every second the Yorktown and her aircraft remained operational. Every strike that landed sent shockwaves of doubt through the Japanese ranks. Below the deck of the American carrier, sailors manned guns, loading, aiming, and firing with intense focus. Anti-aircraft fire raked through the sky, protecting the planes as they made their runs, creating a shield of steel and fury. Engineers monitored engines, signaling pilots with flags and lights, ensuring that every launch was flawless, every sortie executed with deadly efficiency. It was a ballet of chaos, precision, and courage, each man playing a role that could change the course of the war. As the battle intensified, the Japanese realized the full extent of the Yorktown's presence. Ships that had assumed dominance now fought desperately to defend themselves, scrambling to launch planes, man anti-aircraft guns, and patch damage as bombs rained down. Smoke curled skyward, flames licked the decks, and the once unshakable confidence of the enemy began to crumble. The psychological advantage had shifted entirely in favor of the Americans. Lieutenant Johnson's squadron dove toward a Japanese carrier, weaving between anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. Bombs released, engines screaming, the deck below erupting in violent flames. Every hit, every direct strike, was a testament to the human ingenuity, courage, and resilience that had brought the Yorktown back from the brink of destruction. The Japanese, still reeling from the shock of her appearance, could only scramble to respond, their formations faltering, their plans unraveling in real dash time. For the first time in the battle, the tide began to turn. What had started as a calculated Japanese offensive transformed into a desperate defense, with American carriers, led by the Yorktown, striking with surgical precision. The element of surprise, the audacity of the repair crews, and the skill of the pilots combined to shift momentum in a matter of hours. Ships that had seemed untouchable were burning. Planes that had dominated the Pacific skies were now retreating under fire. And all the while, the Yorktown pressed forward, her deck alive with movement, her crew a living testament to endurance and ingenuity. The Japanese had celebrated victory too soon. Now, as the sun climbed higher, they confronted a truth they had never anticipated. The carrier they had written off, the ghost of their triumph, had returned to the fight with lethal intent. In that moment, history pivoted. The roar of engines, the flash of bombs, the cries of men in the sky and on the decks below all converged into a single, undeniable fact. The USS Yorktown was no longer a symbol of what had been lost. She was a force of change, a turning point in a battle that would reshape the Pacific, and a reminder that nothing, not even enemy certainty, could withstand human resolve and courage. The battle had begun, and in the chaos, the Yorktown had already begun to write her legend. Smoke hung heavy over the waters of Midway, mingling with the salt spray and the acrid scent of burning fuel. The once pristine decks of Japanese carriers were now scarred with craters and blackened by flames. Bombs had torn through hulls, setting ammunition stores alight, and fires raged uncontrollably. Pilots who had celebrated their victories over the Coral Sea now scrambled in panic, trying to regroup, trying to make sense of the chaos that had erupted with the sudden, deadly precision of the American counterattack. The USS Yorktown loomed at the center of it all, her presence a constant, almost spectral threat. From her deck, sailors and pilots coordinated strikes, relaying information, adjusting targets, and ensuring that every attack hit its mark. Morale on the carrier was electric, tempered by fatigue and the knowledge of what they had overcome. Men who had labored for 72 hours in Pearl Harbor, who had stared into the abyss of defeat, now watched their efforts pay off in real time. The ship was not just a tool of war, it was a symbol, a testament to the ingenuity, courage, and resilience of the Americans who had refused to let her die. Below decks, the chaos was no less intense. Medics rushed between the wounded, their hands slick with sweat and blood, treating burns, shrapnel wounds, and broken bones with whatever supplies were at hand. Sailors helped one another through smoke-choked corridors, forming human chains to carry injured comrades to safety. Quick decisions had to be made, planes rearmed on the fly, engines repaired under pressure, anti-aircraft guns reloaded between sorties. Every small act, every sacrifice, was magnified in the crucible of battle. Above, the Japanese carriers faltered. Ships that had once projected dominance were now exposed, their air wings decimated and decks ablaze. Officers shouted orders, but coordination had collapsed, replaced by confusion and fear. Pilots who had once executed attacks with precision now scrambled to defend their own vessels, the earlier confidence of triumph replaced by desperation. Messages crackled over radio channels, frantic and disjointed. "We've lost contact with carrier number 3. Repeat, carrier number 3. The celebration of Coral Sea had vanished entirely, replaced by the harsh reality of Midway's counterattack. The American strike teams, guided by intelligence, executed their attacks with meticulous efficiency. Dive bombers plunged toward decks that were once thought untouchable, releasing payloads with unerring accuracy. Torpedo squadrons swept in, low, drawing fire and forcing Japanese pilots to split their focus, creating openings that the Yorktown's planes exploited. Smoke and fire consumed the enemy's carriers, the once formidable formations unraveling under relentless, coordinated assaults. On the flight deck of the Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander George Murray watched the planes return, spotting damage, guiding repairs, and shouting encouragement. "Keep her steady. We're not done yet," he barked, his voice cutting through the roar of engines and the thunder of explosions. Every returning pilot, every successfully executed strike, reinforced the morale of the men aboard. They were not only fighting for survival, they were fighting to rewrite the course of the war amid the chaos. Moments of heroism stood out sharply. A sailor ran into a hangar engulfed in flames to drag a trapped pilot to safety. Engineers crawled beneath twisted machinery to stabilize engines mid-battle. Medics worked tirelessly, comforting and stabilizing the injured while the carrier shuddered with each maneuver. Each act, however small in isolation, contributed to the larger momentum. Each decision, each flash of courage, tipped the scale further in America's favor. As the hours passed, the Japanese Navy's disarray deepened. Communications faltered, formations broke apart, and the psychological shock of encountering the Yorktown alive and striking was evident in every command decision. Victory, once assumed, was slipping through their fingers. Confidence had been replaced with panic, celebration with chaos. The tide of battle had turned unmistakably. By the evening, the extent of the Japanese losses became clear. Carriers that had dominated the Pacific were now crippled or burning, their air wings decimated and their plans for Midway shattered. American forces had not only defended the atoll, they had struck a decisive blow against the heart of Japan's offensive capability. The Yorktown, once presumed lost, had proven itself pivotal. Her planes had executed strikes that changed the course of the battle. Her very presence had forced the enemy into mistakes, hesitation, and ultimately disaster. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the scarred waters, sailors aboard the Yorktown paused to watch. Exhausted, bloodied, and battered, they reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them here from the brink of destruction at Coral Sea to the heart of a turning point in the Pacific. Their carrier, resurrected against all odds, had done more than survive. She had altered history. The contrast could not have been starker. Japanese confidence, once absolute, had given way to shock and chaos. American determination, ingenuity, and courage had turned despair into triumph. And at the center of it all, the Yorktown remained, a living, breathing testament to resilience, strategy, and the indomitable spirit of those who refused to surrender. The tide had turned. Midway had been won, and in the hearts of the men aboard the Yorktown, a quiet understanding settled. They had witnessed history being made, and they had been the instruments of that change. The USS Yorktown had done the impossible. From the brink of destruction at the Coral Sea, she had been resurrected in 72 grueling hours, her steel patched, her engines roaring, her planes ready for action. She had sailed into Midway not as a remnant of defeat, but as a weapon of precision, turning the tide of battle in ways few could have imagined. The Japanese, so confident of victory, had been blindsided. Their celebrations, their certainty, their assumed triumph all had been undone by the determination and ingenuity of the Americans who refused to let history slip through their fingers. Survivors of the battle remembered the intensity with a clarity that never faded. Lieutenant William Johnson would later recall the roar of the deck beneath his feet, the heat of engines warming for takeoff, and the knowledge that every sortie could be his last. "We weren't just fighting for the ship," he said quietly years later. "We were fighting for each other, for every man who had labored through the night to bring her back to life. Engineers who had spent days under sweat and smoke repairing what seemed irreparable remembered the pride that surged as the Yorktown slid into open waters, a living, breathing monument to resilience. Commanders reflected on the larger significance. Midway had been a gamble, a test of intelligence, courage, and nerve. The return of the Yorktown had shifted the balance in ways that could not be overstated. Every strike she launched, every pilot she carried into the skies, had compounded the Japanese confusion and losses. Historians would later agree, without the Yorktown, the outcome at Midway and perhaps the entire trajectory of the Pacific War might have been drastically different. Her comeback was not just a technical triumph. It was a turning point in strategy. A psychological blow to an overconfident enemy. The story of the Yorktown became legend, a symbol of American tenacity. From the crew who endured exhaustion and injury to the planners who kept her return secret from prying eyes, each contribution formed a mosaic of determination and ingenuity. In the chaos of war, when destruction seemed inevitable, the ship's revival reminded the world that courage and relentless effort could defy even the most impossible odds. As the Pacific waves continued to ripple under the sun, the Yorktown's wake served as a metaphor. It was the wake of persistence, of hope, and of refusal to surrender. Every sailor who had stepped aboard her, every hand that had patched her steel, every pilot who had launched from her deck had been part of something larger than themselves. History often remembers battles, strategies, and leaders, but sometimes it remembers symbols. The Yorktown became one of those symbols. Her story endures not merely as a tale of a ship, but as a testament to the spirit of those who believe that nothing is truly lost until hope itself is gone. The carrier that should have died rose again, changed history, and became a reminder that even in the darkest hours, perseverance, ingenuity, and courage can carve a path to triumph. And so, the USS Yorktown sails forever in memory of Phoenix of steel and courage, rising from the ashes to prove that in the Pacific, as in life, the impossible is only a challenge waiting to be met.